Welcome to Imposter Hour with Liz and Greg. We're here to explore the imposter syndrome that haunts creatives, delving into how it affects their lives and work. Join us as we chat with authors and artists about creativity, self-doubt, featuring imposter characters in their stories, and the occasional imposter who pops up in their day-to-day lives.
And today we have the pleasure of welcoming Alison Buccola to the show. Allison is the author of Catch Her When She Falls and The Ascent, out tomorrow as of this episode airing. She has a JD from the University of Chicago and lives in the Chicago suburbs with her husband and their 2 young children. Allison, thank you for being here. Welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, we're thrilled.
So thrilled. And before we started recording, I was just gushing about my reading experience with your just published book, The Ascent. And I have so many questions, but one of the comments I wanted to make is I had this experience, which is my favorite reading experience, where I started becoming so invested in your characters in the story, I kind of lost the thread about who was in real life and who was in the page. So it was that kind of wonderful, like, dissonance of like, is Ophelia your main character? Like, she feels like my friend and I want to check in on her. And I was getting, random text messages and really had that sense of like where the book began and ended and where my life began and ended. So congratulations on writing.
Oh, thank you. Well, that is a hope and dream when you're when you're writing a book. So I really appreciate that.
Sure. And I guess you checked a lot of my personal boxes of like subject matter that I loved. This book talks about postpartum anxiety, about kind of some ambivalence in motherhood. You delve into cults. There's, some domestic suspense. There's definitely unreliable narrators. There's just so much that you've kind of rolled into this very cohesive story. And I'm wondering, out of all of those threads, or maybe some other that I haven't mentioned, was there kind of one kernel that kicked you off with this idea?
Yeah, so I knew from the beginning that I wanted to write about a cult. So it started there. And I was watching a lot of cult documentaries and reading a lot of interviews with cult survivors, and came up with the idea of Ophelia. I kept on finding myself when I was watching these documentaries drawn to the story of the cult survivor and their accounts of what happens after they leave the cult.
Yeah.
And I feel like, I love every cult, like all the cult stories. I'm very into them. And I feel like in a lot of them, what you find is you have some, like, the story sort of delving into the allure of a cult, and how they suck people in and how they keep people there. And then the struggle is sort of to break free. So I wanted to write about this character who had already left the cult and sort of what comes for her afterwards. So I started there and then kind of built out Ophelia from that point.
Well, sorry to jump on you, Greg, if you were going to ask the next question, but it's going to be one of those interviews where you're going to have to arm wrestle me the whole time. I think it would be really wonderful for our listeners to kind of hear the setup of your story, because there are a lot of novels about cults, but I think yours in particular takes a really interesting and unique perspective, which is, the lone survivor. Can you talk about like just the elevator pitch of the book,
Sure.
so we can not, be too obscuring for the listener?
Yeah, so the story is about a woman who grew up in a reclusive community or a reclusive cult. And one morning when she was 12 years old, she woke up and everyone had disappeared. So everyone's gone, including her mother and sister, and the mystery of their disappearance is never solved. And then the story opens 20 years later when she is living in Philadelphia. She's built a new life for herself. She's now a mother, a wife. She's living in this well-to-do area. And she's sort of struggling with new motherhood. She's dealing with something like postpartum anxiety. Is getting kind of paranoid. And someone shows up at her front door claiming to be someone from her past. And we can kind of delve a little bit into who that person is from her past. And so she's got to figure out whether or not she can trust that person.
I would love to just, if you don't mind, if I could read just a small passage from the book itself. This is actually from Ophelia's inner monologue, but I think this sums up this theme really, really beautifully. I quote here, "I've spent my whole life running from the past. I should know by now that hiding doesn't make it go away. It only leaves you unprepared when the past comes to reclaim you. And that is such a great sort of way to like encapsulate that whole idea of our past potentially like dogging us, catching up with us, being this thing that's sort of depending on your circumstances. And I think for Ophelia, very particularly, that sort of that like encroaching trauma that's always sort of there. Could you talk a bit about how that theme played into the book?
Yeah, so this is something that she went through when she was 12, but I think she's never really fully come to terms with her loss.
Right.
And I think I also, in addition to writing about cults, I wanted to write about motherhood, which you touch on a little bit. And I think one thing about motherhood in particular is when you have a child, all of a sudden you're sort of reassessing your past and how you grew up, and you're sort of forced to confront parts of your past and sort of view them in a different way than you might have before. So Ophelia has never really fully dealt with the loss of her family and what happened, and then she has her own daughter, and that event sort of forces her to try to come to terms with what happened to her.
Well, one of the really amazing, I think, kind of plot threads that you have throughout is this kind of use of Ophelia's life in the cult and early days informing how she views the world around her. And then, by extension, how the people around her imagine she views the world. And this kind of creates this unreliable narrator device, but I think in an inverse way, and as the reader, I was really feeling kind of on tenterhooks about, is her own sense of reality trustworthy? So I'm curious if you can walk us through a little bit how you like threaded that needle, because I think, someone who was in a cult but born into a cult as opposed to brought into it, like what her mindset, what her influence, and what her reality or her sense of reality might be. How did you navigate that writing her psychology?
Yeah, so I think that point about her being born into the cult is a really interesting one, and is one that I had a lot of fun playing around with when I was creating her character. Because I think that when you're looking at cult survivors and you're sort of listening to their stories, I think it's difficult for a lot of people to sort of reconnect with society. But for children who are born into a group, they're not reconnecting; they're connecting for the first time. So all of Ophelia's sort of ways of viewing the world and her early associations were created in this group, were created in Jacob's Hill. And so she's now entering into mainstream society and is a stranger to it. So she sort of has to pretend her way through it. And yeah, I think it was a lot of fun thinking about her identity and how she's relating to her husband, who she meets, I guess, doing the math, maybe 15 years after this incident, something like that. And she's trying to put up this normal exterior, but keep on seeing cracks.
Right. One of the things that you dig into that's sort of a corollary plot point is how the media, and particularly social media, tend to sensationalize cult cases. And then also how the kind of speculation around these cases can run rampant and sort of take on a life of their own as well. That becomes sort of more like a, maybe larger than the sum of the parts kind of thing. What got you interested in that aspect of the story?
Yeah, I think just watching a lot of cult documentaries, you do see, when you hear people talking about Jonestown, there's all the jokes about drinking the Kool-Aid.
Right.
And when you are watching things about Nexium, there's all these comments on, these like midnight volleyball games that are really ridiculous, and they're really like, they're really far out. And I think that there's a real entertainment aspect to those parts of the story. But I think that they really don't fit with the experience of the people who are actually there in the cult.
Yeah.
So if you're listening to these stories from cult survivors, they're talking about their family members who are there and these real connections that they have. And I think one thing when you're reading through cult stories that I found really interesting is that I think a lot of times the way documentaries are set up, or the way some of these stories are set up, they're sort of like these fables. Like there's sort of these stories that are meant to have a moral at the end of them. And the idea is, this cult leader it's really alluring. There's this real attraction to like this potentially like beautiful way of life. But this cult leader is a wolf. And if you follow the wolf off the path, bad things are going to happen to you. And I think the media accounts really, really lean into that story. And so it's interesting kind of hearing the more complicated stories that survivors have to bring to the table.
Yeah, I was struck by you. I think you painted a really well-drawn character in the cult leader, Christopher. Is that right? If I
Yeah.
remember. But I was impressed how you didn't have him overshadow, Ophelia and other characters, because I think that can happen both in documentaries and podcasts about cults. It kind of becomes very hyper focused on the leader as opposed to the survivors.
Yeah.
But being that this is Imposter Hour and we do talk about imposters and con artists, one of the things I think is a big, bridge between imposter and con artist and cult leaders is, I think an argument could be made that most cult leaders, if not all, are con artists, in some shade. I'm just wondering, do you kind of agree with that? And when you were doing your research, were there particular cult leaders that you mentioned? Nexium. I was thinking about that guy who's Keith Raniere. Is that?
Yeah.
Were there some others, or was this kind of a amalgam, or just someone who kind of came from your own imagination?
There were a few others. I mean, I did do a lot of reading about sort of survivalist groups because the cult in the book is set in the 90s. And so if you're thinking about a 90s cult, you sort of want a survivalist cult. I did come across, when I was doing my research, this sort of historical cult, Gurdjieff's Institute. I don't know if you're familiar with this. So the short storyist, Catherine Mansfield, who lived like 100 years ago, ended up joining this group led by this like maybe Georgian, maybe Armenian leader who had set up this compound in France. And he had these disciples that were sort of talking to people in London. So Catherine Mansfield attended these talks, T.S. Eliot attended these talks, Aldous Huxley attended these talks. And Catherine Mansfield actually ended up going down to this site that he had in France, and living there for a little while before she ended up dying of tuberculosis when she was down there. But it was really fun. I mean, it was fun kind of like digging into this like historical cult situation. And he had this huge compound. He was sort of like working people all day really hard. So you would just sort of wake up after 3 hours of sleep. You would start like wheelbarrowing rocks across the compound. They would, obviously, a lot of gardening, a lot of care of livestock, and they did a lot of dancing. So they would break after many hours of working all day, and then they would do these elaborate ballets that he had constructed for the people who lived there. And I don't know. I mean, like it's hard to like really get into the. I don't know that I captured Gurdjieff when I was writing Christopher, but there were definitely like pieces of that historical cult that made its way into the book. It was a sort of a rabbit hole that I went down when I was researching. So it was kind of fun to read about.
Yeah. Well, what do you think? I guess this is two parts. What do you think is so fascinating to kind of the culture at large about cults? And then what in particular really fascinated you? I know you said that was kind of the launch point. But is there kind of like one aspect about it? I'd love to hear, because I am fascinated as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that cults just present like this totally different way of life. And I think that there's something scary about that. And also, I think maybe in some ways a little bit appealing. And I think that you have those like two different forces working against each other, where we think that it's probably a bad idea to like go join these communal groups that are living in this entirely different way. But like people go there searching for meaning, and some of the cult members like think that they found meaning there. And so I think that if the cults were just these scary, I mean, not to talk up a cult, but I think that there's this sort of like competing, like we want meaning, and the idea that there might be some place that offers that meaning is really attractive. But then these stories kind of show us how dangerous that search for meaning can be.
Yeah.
And so I think it's sort of these, like, those competing viewpoints that kind of drive people's interest in the cult story.
Yeah.
But I think that sort of hearing about cult members' conflicted feelings once they got out of the group, and sort of their readjustment to society was really what drew me in here.
Well, that brings up an interesting point. I mean, so much of, as you're sort of touching on here, of the cult, the attraction appeal of cult is psychology and the sort of manipulation of psychology. And so I wonder, in the research process, looking at like a wide swath maybe of different cults and different examples and different settings and times and things like that, what were some of the carryovers or through lines that jumped out at you from, one to the other, how those kind of maybe psychological manipulations were very similar, or different practices, or what have you?
Yeah, I mean, you do have I think you do see a lot of the same like behavioral control techniques that sort of carry through from cult to cult. So you'll see people working really long hours. I think you see a lot of sleep deprivation. You see a lot of isolation. So like in Ophelia's case, they weren't talking to people outside, like in the outside society. They're sort of cut off from their family members. And I think that isolation really, really serves to build the group psychology. Yeah.
Well, I definitely will probably want to come back to cults, but we could spend the whole hour. And I want to make sure we kind of get your story a bit. This is your second novel. Was kind of cavelling before about how good a second novel this is. There's no sophomore slump here. But you didn't necessarily, I'm assuming based on your bio, didn't necessarily start out as, someone who went to like get an MFA, for example.
Yeah.
So can you tell us a little bit about your road to becoming a novelist, and maybe if you have any unfinished or unpublished novels in your path, and what your kind of experience has been getting to this point?
Yeah, so I did not start out as a novelist. So I've always loved writing, and then I went to college and thought that was not a viable career path to go down. So I ended up going to law school instead, and then was a practicing lawyer for a few years. But when I got pregnant with my son, I realized this was sort of I was working at a law firm, and I was like, I've always wanted to really try to write a book. And I would be really disappointed with myself if I didn't at least try to see if that is something that I could do. And I was also feeling nervous about the idea of juggling motherhood and law firm life and trying to figure that out. So I was like, I'll take a break from it, and I will see what I can do while I'm staying at home with my son. And so I quit my law firm job and then wrote the first book sort of during my son's nap times. And it was a great experience. It was really, I feel like it was a really nice balance to be able to still have some creative outlet, and then also really dive into motherhood. And I really enjoyed it. But it was, I feel like the writing part of it at that time still did sort of feel like an embarrassing hobby that I had. It was, it was this thing that I sort of did secretly to for myself. And was a little bit embarrassed to talk about with people. But then when I got pregnant with my daughter, I was like, I need to actually send out this manuscript and see if I can do something with it. I need to finish it first of all, because if I don't finish it before the second kid gets here, I'm never gonna do anything with it. And so I finished it. I forced myself to finish it, and I sent it off. And that one ended up becoming Catch Her When She Falls. So that was my first book, which I felt extremely lucky about. And then I don't have any fully unwritten manuscripts, but I do have a lot of false starts that are manuscript length that happened between writing Catch Her When She Falls and writing The Ascent. So I knew after that I wanted to write something cult related, but kept on coming up with these stories and these characters where I was like, I don't know if that's really, they had the same names, but I was like, I don't know if that's really the direction that I want to go down. So I have a few 60,000 word documents that are not actually books that came in between the two books.
Mm. It's amazing to me how many mothers, writers we've had on this podcast who were like, I'm going to get this book out while I'm pregnant or while I have my small child, or I need to get this made. Like the amount of productivity, creative productivity that is born out of motherhood is astounding to me, given that you have sleep deprivation and a small child or a medium child running around. I mean, it's like, can we just stop and say, wow, that you wrote your first book with a small child at home? But I also, certainly in the Ascent, I can see how your processing of motherhood, even if it wasn't your particular experience, but maybe it was, but my experience reading it was there was like so much truth and experiential or observational, it just felt very real. The kind of postpartum feelings, the feelings of anxiety and fear that you have Ophelia going through about just like putting her child in pre-K or daycare, giving up her career, all of these, very real experiences that mothers and fathers go through. And I'm wondering how motherhood has informed and changed your writing from one book to the next. And how much do you kind of draw from your own experiences in that respect?
Yeah, I mean, I also think I've heard a lot of other people who have also written their their books with young kids at home. And I do think that motherhood sort of forces you to like take stock of how much time you have, because it's so limited, and to really like make something out of the time that you have. Like those constraints I think are really helpful for creativity.
Yeah.
So I think just as a practical matter, all of a sudden only having these like 1 or 2 hour windows to write in makes you want to like make use of those 1 or 2 hour windows instead of like going downstairs to get another coffee and like or going over to Starbucks or whatever.
Right.
So I think that it's really helped there. And yeah, I do. I mean, I don't think I could have written this book without having like the lived experience of being a mother. So I don't know. I would not. I don't think that I had postpartum anxiety personally, but I am an anxious person, and I do think that. I mean, there's so much fear, and that goes along with motherhood. It's such a big, huge, like life shifting occurrence. All of a sudden, you're responsible for this small person. And it's like a terrifying experience. So definitely did dig into my own personal experiences of motherhood, thinking about Ophelia's sort of response to it. And so my kids are now 5 and 8. So I'm not in the new mother period anymore. But when I sort of started thinking about this book, new motherhood was much closer. And my daughter was actually she was a COVID baby, so she was like 6 months old when COVID hit, and I feel like that sort of, brought about all sorts of other anxieties and challenges when you're trying to raise an infant, that sort of played into my psyche when I was thinking about new motherhood.
Okay.
Sure.
Well, you touch on your parenthood, and you touch on your legal experience, which are obviously personal experiences. But within the Ascent as well, you're also you're diving into cult psychology and that sort of history. You're also there are some scenes that are set in a psychiatric facility, and the granular detail that you bring to all of those various things. I mean, you're touching on a lot of things thematically and setting wise and things like that. And you have such granular detail. And I think that speaks to what Liz was saying earlier in the conversation about feeling like you're reading, these people that and these friends and these people that you really get invested in and care about. And I think that a lot of that comes down to the specificity of detail that you imbue the story with. Could you just talk a bit about the kind of wide ranging research process that seems like it would have gone into this novel?
Yeah, well, thank you. So I think that sort of to the extent that I can kind of walk through an environment and see what it would be like to sort of be there experiencing and interacting with the setting. I think it really like helps bring a story to life.
Yeah.
So the story is set in Philadelphia, which is also where I had my two kids. And I think it's actually kind of hard to imagine for me, right? I mean, obviously people write about things that they don't have personal experience with all the time, but I think it was really helpful having raised my own kids in like not just raise them in general, but raise them in Philadelphia.
Yeah.
And so but I like was walking around Philadelphia and had the experience of having to be hard to get up, like the particular kinds of houses that you have, like stairs that you have in Philadelphia.
Right.
And I think that those are like any given location is going to be a different experience of motherhood. And so being able to kind of like walk through it and experience it yourself and then describe like the way that that setting affects you or would affect that character is really helpful. For the compound is a little trickier because I didn't have access to like an actual cult to like walk around in. But we actually did have a like a Quaker meeting house, like resort kind of area that was close to where we lived in the Philly area. And that was compoundy. I mean, they are not a cult, but the way that it was set up was structured in a way that you could kind of imagine a cult moving into this location. So, you know, they had their gardens and they had the different places where people slept and they had their meeting house. And so actually just being able to like walk through those paths and think about how those different things related to each other, how the cult members would have used them, what their day would have looked like if they were there was really helpful. And the mental institution was probably the hardest thing to write about because I also didn't have physical access to that.
Okay.
So I mostly used YouTube for that, YouTube and then written accounts of people in institutions. But ideally, if I can walk through something, I really do want to be able to actually walk through it to be able to kind of get that feel.
Sure.
Kind of picking up on the research thread, I know for myself, one of the best parts of like the creative process is when I decide I'm going to write about something and then, you know, get like a Google and documentary masters in that subject. I can spend, you know, endless hours watching and reading and clicking. And I'm wondering for you, because I know for myself, sometimes it's hard not to just stay in that mode. So when do you know like it's time to pause the research and actually get to the story? And then when you find yourself with like so much information, what do you know you're going to use, or how do you kind of discern what is going to end up on the page?
Yeah, so I try to, I mean, it's hard at the very beginning of a story where you don't really know where you're going to go, but I do try to keep myself to 1,000 words a day requirement, even if I don't know what the story is about yet. And even if those words are probably going to have to be discarded when the story changes, I still try to like sit down and actually write. Because otherwise, I also love researching and I love going down rabbit holes. And I would just do that. And then I would check that off as like having done my work for the day if I didn't sort of force myself to write. So I'll research all the way through the project, but I try to discipline myself by making sure that I have actually gotten in words that day and I'm not using the research as a way to like kind of avoid my writing, which I will do.
Sure.
So.
Oh yeah.
That's very practical of you.
Yeah, that's probably my number one source of procrastination is research. Keep it going. Keep it going.
Well, it feels so good. You're like, no, I really am doing this. I really am like
of course.
working on my project.
I'm going to be very oblique with this question, so as not to give anything away with your wonderful story. But being that you are on Imposter Hour with Liz and Greg, I can't not ask about all of the various permutations of these and different characters in the story who are playing various imposter roles, either in one another's lives, sometimes with kind of even the way they're representing their own history or their own kind of interpersonal or interfamily kinds of situations. And it adds a really nice tension to the story as well. Not only does it build the world well, but it really adds tension and really calibrates that well. Could you talk about kind of how you were able to ratchet the tension up and kind of heighten the drama through that kind of imposterdom throughout your characters?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I will also try to avoid spoilers while I'm talking about them. But I do think like the main character, Lee, is herself sort of a form of imposter, and she has this traumatic background as a former cult member, and she really does not want the people in her life to know about that. So she has this that she's sort of holding as a secret, which I think is great for building tension in a story, because she doesn't want anyone to find that out. And so anything that is potentially going to reveal that information to her husband, to her friends, to her very nosy mother-in-law, like that's all a threat to her. So I think it's a fun way to kind of introduce a threat.
Yeah.
And then there's another character, the character who shows up at her doorstep, who I won't say too much about. Yep. But that's someone that she has to figure out if she can trust. And like part of the driving tension there is like, can she really believe that this person is who she says she is? And I think that like that trust question is something that animates, I mean, tons of psychological suspense. Like, sure. Do we really know the people around us? How far can we trust them? If we're wrong, or is anyone going to believe us that we're wrong? And so that was a really fun character to introduce. And I actually, when I started, I had, the idea for this disappearing cult and this person showing up. And initially, when I was working on the story, I didn't know what was going to happen with that mysterious character. And so I wrote all these scenes, and like it could have gone either way. And in part it could have gone either way because like I was like, I don't really know yet who is she, at least in the first draft. And then obviously in subsequent drafts I figured it out and fleshed it out. But I think sometimes that uncertainty, like as a writer, kind of helps drive forward the tension, because you kind of have to write things both ways.
Right. I would love to actually follow up on that. You used the word trust a few moments ago. And one of the things that I think you do really beautifully in this book as well, you explore the sort of the corollaries between mental health care and the ways that like gender biases and also socioeconomics can influence the kind of care that people receive and the resources available to certain individuals. Could you sort of give our listeners a little bit of a snapshot of what that situation can look like?
Yeah. So I think that, I think for Lee, she is a new mother, and she's dealing with, the normal anxieties that go along with new motherhood. But she has these fears about things happening to her daughter. And some of the characters in the book are sort of writing them off as just motherhood fears, as like just woman fears, as things that just need to be like treated and ignored. And I think for Lee, the question is like, but is there really something else going on here? And she can't really or she's worried she's not going to be able to get people to listen to her truth. And in terms of the socioeconomics of it, I'm trying to think if there's anything I can say without. I'm going to save that one, because that one's tricky to talk about. But
no, fair enough.
Well, I'm just thinking, this is a thought that's forming, so forgive me. It probably will be all over the place, but there was like kind of a thematic or textural feeling in your book that reminded me of Gaslight, of The Yellow Wallpaper, these kind of classic films or movies. I'm thinking of Rebecca, where there's just so much kind of doubt and disbelief in the female leads, and this kind of the trust as far as you telling this story and me as the reader trusting that you are going to bring me to this end that's going to be satisfying, which you absolutely do. I'm wondering if you felt pressure both in the writing of the novel itself and the character of Lee, and then getting to the end and making it satisfying and I guess believable. What kind of like, did you have it all plotted out? Was it kind of leading you? Because again, I like don't want to ruin anything, but you do such a good job of landing the finish.
Yeah.
But it doesn't feel like cheap or like you're just tying it up for the sake of tying it up. And it lends itself to this kind of texture, this Hitchcockian, this like, paranoia, delusional, who's to be believed perception of reality. So it's a bit of a hat trick, and I think you pull it off. And I remember kind of finishing the book and really sitting with like, wow, it's very emotional. it's very realistic and it's really satisfying. Though that's just my perspective. You may have different, Goodreads may say otherwise. Who knows? But can you tell us about what it was like to kind of get to that ending? And did you know what it was going to look like?
Yeah, I did not initially know what it was going to look like. So I am, I would like to be more of a plotter, but I'm like not really much of a plotter but this book I actually did. So this book I sold on proposal. So I did have to like write my first 6 chapters, and then I wrote a synopsis for what the whole book was going to look like. And if you look back at my synopsis, it's not the same ending that this book ended up with. But it is like roughly what I was working towards when I was first working on the draft. But I did hit a point, I don't know if it was like halfway through or 3/4, it was probably about halfway through, where I was like writing up to this ending, and I was like, that just doesn't like that ending can't happen. Like it can't happen with these characters. It doesn't like it's actually like I don't know, it was just like it wasn't working, and it wasn't going to have the right kind of like emotional resonance. But it was really fun. Like I think it's a really fun moment in writing to then like go back and look and be like, oh, that can't happen because this has to happen. Like this is the thing that this book is leading up to, and so that's where this has to go. And so it felt in that moment it felt really organic. Before it got to that moment, it felt really messy and uncertain, and like it might never lead up to that moment. But I think when I realized that the initial ending that I had in mind wasn't going to work, it then did actually become very clear like what the ending had to be. So I'm really glad that it felt organic and natural to you.
Yeah.
And I hope it feels organic and natural to other readers too. So we'll see.
Now, would you attribute that to being more of a pantser and sort of, the character is sort of guiding you at a certain point in the story? Do you find that takes you where you need to, in that organic direction that you're talking about?
I think so. I think it takes me a while to kind of get to figure out like who the characters are,
Yeah,
and what they're doing and what they would not be doing. And so that I think that's part of the problem that I've had with trying to sit down and outline before, is just that like I don't know that I personally can get a full sense of who my characters are without writing like lots of scenes with them in it.
yeah.
And so I just can't. I have to like be in it to kind of figure out where they're gonna go.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I don't know. I'm thinking about Charlie Kaufman and the adaptation of The Orchid Thief, and like the characters kind of talking to him.
Right.
And I love that idea. I think we've talked about it with quite a few writers that we start out with these kind of directions and these characters, but they really very rarely end up where we think they're going to. And the idea of like the characters kind of talking to you. And I'm wondering, there's this husband character who is very interesting, and you've done a really good job, I think, about making him fully fleshed out, but also kind of mysterious. But he's the one with the legal background, and I'm wondering how it was for you to write a male character, someone who's not as front and center, but you clearly have the background of the legal piece of it. What was that like for you to kind of imbue your old life job into the new one?
Yeah. Well, that was kind of fun because he has this legal background, so he has this legal knowledge, but he's also like existing in this like law culture. And so, his friends, he has friends really more so than Lee has friends. Like he's more embedded in the world. So his friends have kind of become Lee's friends, but they're like really his friends. And it was fun because I was like, oh, well, I know these people. Like this is easy to write because these are the types of people that, I know from law school and I'm friends with. And and the husband character in particular, he has his good and bad traits, I think, as all characters do, and especially all characters in thrillers do. And I think some of his good traits, I would say, are pulled from my husband's a lawyer. He's not a practicing lawyer anymore either, but he teaches now, but he is also has a legal background. And so some of those good traits are pulled from him. But I think when he was also reading the bad traits, he's like, what is this? Like, no, not the, you're just the good parts. But but yeah.
Liz and I often, one of the advantages of being a writing duo is that if one of us writes something sort of uncomfortable or unflattering, we can always blame the other person for
Right.
that.
Yes.
It's like we sort of have this running joke that if there's ever a sex scene in the book and one of our parents read it, it's like, no, the other one wrote
Yeah.
Yeah.
Totally.
Oh, that's really handy.
Yeah, helps avoid a lot of uncomfortable kind of stuff. I'm curious. There's something you start off the acknowledgments to the Ascent with the sentence, writing a second book is a much less private endeavor than writing a first book.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering sort of for maybe anyone who's listening, who's a little bit, earlier in their author journey, if you could sort of just elaborate on that idea a bit.
Yeah. So when I kind of mentioned before, but when I started writing the first book, it was my hobby, and it was a hobby that I didn't even really feel very comfortable talking to a lot of people about.
Right.
So I did, once I got kind of far into the first one, I joined a local critique group, which was really helpful because you start building up this community of people who also like writing, who can give you feedback, you can learn from them, and they can help you out with your own writing craft. And so that started to feel more like, oh, I'm building up this writer community.
Yeah.
But it still does feel like you're, when you're sending out your manuscript to agents and trying to find it, you're alone, you're in your house, you're just kind of shooting off these emails into the void and hoping that maybe someone responds.
Right.
And I think even in writing that first book, once I did have my agent and my editor, you have your agent who guides you through, and I love my agent, she's great. But I didn't yet know that many other authors, traditionally published authors, who were going through the same kind of experience. So all of it was kind of new and unexpected, and you just don't know what's going to happen next, or how it works, or how these things are supposed to look. And then, but for the second book, I started going to, different author conferences, and I've met both of you at Thriller Fest, and all of a sudden you start to have this community of people, and you're you really feel like you're more part of this author world.
Yeah.
So when I wrote the second book, I had, Julia, my agent, is part of my team. I had the same editor that I had for the first book. That kind of shifted halfway through, but she's still, I have the same team there. And then also had, friends in the writing world who I could send the manuscript to and get feedback from. And you just it's just such a different and much more communal feeling. But I think if you're just starting out, the faster that you can get yourself into a writing group and into some space where there's other writers and other people who are doing it, that it can feel very lonely writing. So just getting yourself in there and connecting is really valuable, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, we definitely agree. That also lends itself nicely to the imposter syndrome question. And I'm wondering, where in your life it shows up, and if you had imposter syndrome, writing your first novel as opposed to your second, and if it's, changed, gotten less, more, other.
Yeah, no, I definitely feel like I'm an imposter a lot of the time. And I've been realizing it. So we just moved, I'm in Chicago now. We just moved to Chicago kind of recently. And I've been meeting lots of new people. And I have this real aversion to calling myself an author. And I don't know why. It feels like people ask you're meeting new people, and they're like, oh, are you at home with your kids? Do you work? What do you do? I'm like, oh, I write things. And I don't know, I feel self-conscious about calling myself an author, even though that's very obviously what I'm doing. I have a book out, I have another book coming out.
Yeah.
I have a third book that I'm working on. That is, but I don't know. It just does feel, it is definitely the imposter syndrome at play, I think. And I think also anytime that I start a new project, I started the second book and I thought it was going to be easier because I had written the first book before. But as I mentioned, I have tons of discarded pages that are just not even close to being the right book. And then I started this third book that I'm working on now. And I was like, well, it took me a long time to kind of get on the right track for the second book, but this time I know how to do it, and this is going to be great and easy. But it's not. I feel like every time I start a new book, it is, I'm like, oh, I forgot how to write a book.
Yep.
And I don't know how to do this. I don't know who my characters are. And I don't know where this is going.
Right.
I've now figured out for this next book who my characters are, I think, and it feels a lot better. But I feel like there's always that like moment of panic, and I don't know if it'll get better. I hope it does.
Yeah.
But
well, let me follow up on that. Going now from book 1 to book 2, then book 2 to book 3. Do you find that it's oftentimes the same, let's say, maybe point in the process when like you start thinking about the, you know, the idea for the next book, or is there something that kind of clicks? Like, has it been the same each time, or have you noticed, you know, some differences?
yeah, I think it's, I think that there's a very clear click for the second book. So I was kind of struggling through trying to write the draft. And then at some point I was like, oh, the cult disappears. Like that is what happens in this book.
Okay.
And I think that it actually like I think the cult disappeared first. And then soon after I was like, and Lee's a mother. And like those two things are what have to happen. And as soon as those two ideas came, then the book like actually came very fast. And so that felt like a real click. I think with this third book that I've been working on, the main characters in it right now, there's like 3 sisters in it.
Yeah.
And I think figuring out each sister has been like its own separate process.
Okay.
And so like I now feel like I'm at the point where I'm like, oh, I know who these sisters are. I know what they're doing. I know how they're relating to each other. But like any character being a little bit off like affects that. So this one felt less like an instant where it kind of all came together, and more like once I got all the sisters down, I was like, okay, now I see kind of what we have to do here. But
so it sounds like when you get the sort of at the point where you start to feel like the interpersonal stuff locks in, that kind of takes you. Okay.
I think that's right.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Well, I'm curious, and I always love to hear, you know, what part of the process do you love and what part do you maybe not love so much? You know, there's the kind of brainstorming, researching, the writing, the revising, and then of course there's the promoting and the outfacing, you know, the business of it. There's the social media. I mean, where do you fall on the spectrum of, you know, I love this, I hate this, I could live without this?
Yeah, I would say I hate the early stages. Like I hate the coming up with the idea part, and like the first draft is I think a really scary thing. And I enjoy parts of like drafting the first draft, but I think that worry of like, is this all going to come together? Am I going to figure out who these characters are? Like, does this go anywhere? Or like, how's this? It's like, that's a stressful process for me.
Yeah.
I love revising. I think revising is so much fun. And once I've like figured out who the characters are and figured out the world that they exist in, and they kind of take on a life of their own, and they're doing things in this world and like engaging with it, like that's such a fun feeling. So I like that part of the process. And then when you have to promote it, I go back to not liking it that much anymore.
I'm with you.
Yes.
And what about when it's out in the world? Do you read reviews? Are you, what kind of self-care do you do around that?
Yeah, I do. I tried not. I mean, I know it's bad for me to like look at this stuff. It is hard to resist looking. And I do want to like figure out what's resonating with people and what's not. I mean, I feel like I'm very good at receiving criticism for a work in progress because it feels so productive.
Yeah.
And it feels less productive when you're reading things about something that's already out, where you're like, okay, well now, but I can't fix that. So like, what am I going to do with that? But I think it is kind of useful sometimes to like think about the future project. I don't know. I'm not sure if that's true, or if I'm just like, I maybe should just stay away more than I do. I do have like, I have a friend who will go through and like highlight some nice Goodreads quotes and stuff for me, which is really nice. I feel like having that kind of friend is a very useful thing. But I do like, I don't know, I probably am in it more than I should be. And I'm going to have to, when this book comes out, I'll probably have to like reassess and think about like, is this serving me? Am I like, should I be here, or should I just be like focusing on the next book and doing that instead?
Am I just here for the masochism?
Yeah.
But I also think you just may have created like an amazing job, which is someone who goes through online reviews and pulls out the positive and like creates like a daily positive newsletter for the author. So that we don't ever have to see. Yeah. I mean, I think that this is, you know, I think in the olden days when there was more review coverage in newspapers and book review sections, and there was a lot more books being reviewed, reading reviews was kind of a rite of passage. But I think now that anyone and everyone can write reviews, even write reviews for books they haven't read,
Yeah.
it makes it a lot more kind of dangerous and less, I think, of a rite of passage. So
Yeah.
I love
Yeah, and it is like, I think what also with just the amount of it, there's so much of it that's contradictory. So like in the reviews that I have seen that have come so far, like there's some people who are like, this is like really slow, or like people are like, this is fast, and there's turns at every moment, and I'm like, I don't know, I guess the pacing just like strikes people differently, and like I don't know what to do with that, but
right.
Well, can you, with the last few minutes we have of your time today, can you tell us, or what can you tell us, I guess maybe at this point, about book 3, if anything? Are you able to kind of discuss yet?
Yeah, it's still early stages, and it still might change some. So it is about 3 sisters. I think it is set more around here, this Chicago area,
Okay.
close to Lake Michigan. And the 3 sisters all have a very different recollection of their past, and that's sort of coming to a head in it. And that's probably about as much detail as I can give right now, which is not much, but a little.
But incredibly intriguing. I'm
Indeed.
here for it.
Thanks.
This has been such a pleasure. I want everyone to read your new book. Where can people find you in the world and connect with you? And what are you going to be doing to promote the Ascent?
Yeah, so in the real world, I'm going to be doing some events I'll do an event at Anderson's Bookshop in Downers Grove, if you're in the Chicago area.
Great.
And 57th Street Books in Hyde Park, also if you're in the Chicago area.
Great.
And I will be at the Helen Kate Furness Library if you're in the Philly suburb area. And online, Instagram is probably the best way to find me. So I'm at Alison Buccola on Instagram.
Beautiful.
Great.
All
Thank you again.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you guys. This was so much fun.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, I'm going to take us out. And Allison, thank you again for your time. We really do appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you guys. This really was very fun. So I appreciate it too.
All right. Well, Imposter Hour with Liz and Greg is created and hosted by us, Elizabeth Keenan and Greg Wands. The show is produced and edited by Bookwild Collective founder Kate Herget. Scott Leeds composed our original theme music, and Steve Luoma designed our logo.
And you can find us on Instagram at Imposter Hour Podcast and online at imposterhour.com. Thanks for listening.